The Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 2, Treadmill. The first dead body I saw up close was on my first week as a rookie ambulance technician. He was an old professor who had spent a damp few nights decomposing on his secluded patio. It was clear he was dead. Flies were coming out of his nose and his eyes were full of white pus. But I was fresh from training school and didn't dare argue with my experienced partner's insistence that we attach electrodes to take an ECG for our records. Up close, the stench of the body was that of opening a cellophane-wrapped chicken days past its sell-by date. I gagged, stepping away to take deep breaths of fresh air before returning, holding my breath, to scythe through thick layers of tweed with my trauma shears until I got to the pale blue flesh beneath. A policeman, who had also attended, insisted on moving him to check for suspicious wounds. Putrid purple liquid drained from his ear as he was lifted, rigid as a board. As I gagged at the heightened smell of gas expelled from his stomach, I wondered if this career was actually for me. It certainly wasn't how I envisaged my first week in the job. Nothing can prepare you for the first dead body, but I was wrong to think they'd all be like him. Most, it turned out, were a lot fresher and not as smelly. Too many were not even near approaching their sell-by date. There were exceptions, of course, striking enough to regale whilst waiting on standby, like those that were found slow cooked until the meat was hanging off the bone, either by a gas fire or like some macabre kebab, or by the running hot water in their last bath, sous vide, so to speak. I didn't always find them dead, of course. I'd watch them die too. Standing in the fluorescent haven of a hospital resuscitation room, charged with the excitement, sweating from my individual efforts to keep them alive en route, I have agreed with the assembled medical team that there is no hope and watch the doctors stop working, announcing the time of death while the unconscious patient gaped, their jaw in final breathless gasps, like a landed fish on a grassy riverbank. Except if you had a heart, you could end it quickly for the fish. And I have lied through my teeth when their death occurred at home too. When the relatives would ask, was there anything I could have done? I'd reply reassuringly, no, you did all you could. But my inner voice was screaming, you could have tried CPR. After the professor, only 2 deaths used to come to me in my dreams. With him it was the horror of striking sights and putrid smells. I mean, I couldn't drink red wine for months afterwards without gagging, as its colour reminded me of his draining ear. The memory still catches in my throat now, but the image I play back constantly is less a horror for my senses, more a deep cut in my soul, the grief of one particular woman. As a buttoned-up nation, British people do not really cry at death when surrounded by strangers. We try to be brave and hold it all in. In training, ambulance crews were taught how to break the news of a death, and it is almost always taken with stoicism and repressed emotion by the bereaved relatives. But on this one particular occasion, it was different. My partner told the wife and then left the room as per our training. I stayed, expressed my sympathies as usual, explaining that there was nothing more we could do. I was careful in my choice of words. The patient has not gone to a better place. It was always, he has passed away. It was her guttural sobs, erupting as the realization hit her that she was left alone and facing a massive chasm in her life, that cut through me, through the armour of my role, through my professional detachment, penetrating my heart like microwaves. Devastated in sympathy for her reaction, the harbinger of my own sorrow, I sat with her at the bedside where he lay, thankful that we had bothered to lift him from the floor and cover him, thankful that we had removed the impersonal airway from his mouth and done our best to clean up the sticky residue and mess of resuscitation, that he looked like he was sleeping instead of choking on a sticky plastic pipe. She held his lifeless hand as tears streamed down her cheeks and splashed on their interlaced fingers, and I sat beside her, my hand on her shoulder, and told her it was okay. "How long were you married?" I asked after a while. 60 years was the answer. Was he happy? Yes. Have no regrets, I said, for giving 60 years of happiness. She nodded and placed her hand on mine, and then I had to leave. It's an experience that haunts me to this day. How will my wife or I face this time when it comes to us? Is the good of lifelong partnership worth this terrible, terrible pain at its end? And why did I have to leave that woman's side when she needed me to attend some drunk in a park? To this day, I do not have a satisfactory answer to these questions, but I swore then and still believe now that I must not outlive my children. For the death of a spouse cannot come close to the death of a child, and I would not be able to bear it. It was not uncommon for me to witness or experience such extremes of emotion. It could be down to what we saw other people experiencing or what we were feeling ourselves. It might be being present as a child was being orphaned by catastrophic cardiac arrest, the smell that emits from a body that has been hanging from a loft hatch for a few days before it is cut down, terrible bedside manner of colleagues, and stress at ineptitude or awe at extreme skill and proficiency of medical staff. Drunkenness, terror, it was all there in those rolling shifts. Often it was soul-destroying, but every now and again the emotion was perfect, such as when present at the sea, in the sea of joy as a baby comes without incident into the world, destroying a sofa or a car seat on its entry into its opening act. Despite the statistics, I found it was rare to come across violence and aggression directed at us. Even the extreme reaction to naloxone that some patients could be very funny for the attending crews if we stood a safe distance back, like letting off fireworks when you're a kid. It was a blocking agent for the effects of opioids. We'd light the fuse and run, listening to the room being demolished, giggling stupidly outside as the patient leapt up in mad confusion. In more everyday situations, the crewmates that were actually attacked were usually the ones any sane person would expect to get punched owing to their obnoxious character. Damage could be unintentional too, though, and often perpetrated by the most unlikely candidates. It might be dirty scratches from paralytic drunks, or being downwind of impossible gallons of projectile vomit emitting from demure old ladies in the backs of moving vehicles. What I never bargained for was the threat presented by some colleagues. On one occasion, something occurred on the very first call of our shift. Having run the diagnostic programs on the defibrillator as we checked our kit at the beginning of our shift, our crewmate, a man of bluff and bluster rather than intelligence and diligence, was chatting away as he removed the machine's batteries and headed to the store for charged replacements. He returned, passing me a pile of clean blankets as I checked through the trauma bags. I paid little attention, stowing the pile in a locker and eyeing the pristine white sheet stretched on the biohazard that is an ambulance trolley. The call came soon after we finished checking the kit, and as I had just poured fresh water on tea bags, it was always the way. The shout was for a chest pain patient, so we made a hasty dash for their address out in the sticks. On arrival, we discovered clear indications for a serious heart attack being in progress. "I'm scared," he gasped, clutching his shoulder and belching violently. Looking at him, I expected him to start convulsing at any moment, and acted fast to give him oxygen, to start rigging up the defibrillator for an ECG, pulling out the shock pad wires and untangling them as covertly as possible. The ECG electrodes were placed on his sweating skin, and the button depressed. Nothing. The screen was blank, about as dead as this man was about to be. Of all the times for a kit failure, Everything's going to be fine, I reassured our patient as he lay oblivious to our panicked recognition that there were no batteries in the machine or spares in the locker. Let's just head in, shall we? I suggested as breezily as possible, then made my way urgently to the cab and fired up the engine. My colleague, ashen-faced, made the sign through the hatch to the cab to run fast on lights and sirens. No shit, I thought. Don't worry if you hear the sirens, I heard him say to the anguished patient over the hard gunning of the engine. We'll just use them to get through the traffic. I never covered a distance that fast in a vehicle before or since. I drove like lightning, selling my soul to trade the patient's condition of clear infarction for similar presenting yet less deadly Prinzmetal angina. How could my teammate have forgotten such a vital piece of equipment? How had he explained the lack of ECG at handover? And yet nothing came of it. The bloke was truly non-stick. Thankfully for every fool like him, there were at least two reliable and skillful operators that I always enjoyed working with, and in similar circumstances it was an honour to witness the wonderful caprice of fate and frail humanity in their good company. But this was all too seldom for me, such as my shift patterns had made me sandwiched for most of the year between the idiot and the bull, a man with an exceptional lack of bedside manner, a self-assurance not matched by his skill, and a total lack of team-working ability. It was a tough draw for me. That same particular evening, I'd taken my lunch break at home. I say lunch break, but on this occasion it was in the middle of the night. I needed to get out of the station for respite from my dangerously incompetent crewmate. There was certainly no incentive to spend extra time with him. His conversational skills were equally lacking. I suppose I should add that, for his part, he thought I was overcautious. I had hoped that the mix of our different approaches would prevent any serious errors occurring again, but I couldn't predict every problem, and that was stressful. The situation I now found myself in was not stressful, though. It was just miraculous, and for all his faults, we did share such experiences together. One moment I was eating cornflakes in the kitchen in our small house up the street, and 10 minutes later I was stepping over a severed arm still in its shirt sleeve. Other body parts were scattered along a 100-metre stretch of country road like an impromptu minefield in the dark. The driver had been obliterated by the collision with the oncoming lorry, yet his passenger was sat virtually unscathed in the remaining debris, which consisted of a seat set within a minute gazebo of twisted metal. I was astounded by her luck. It was a weird experience to witness the juxtaposition of cruel fate and unlikely escape that collision represented. I stood on the road where the floor of the car should have been and assisted my colleague in transferring her onto a spinal board. The lead paramedic, a very experienced bloke that I rated, had wrapped up her head in a blanket, assuring her it was against the cold night air. In fact, it was against the grisly scene of her boyfriend, smeared and distributed down the road like the elements of an expensively presented plate of food. The trip to hospital was spent assuring her that she should not concern herself with him, that he would be taken to the same hospital as well. I chose not to add, when the risk of inducing shock was still so high, that he'd be entering via the loading bay doors of the morgue at the back of the building, and that it might be a while before they could bag up all the bits. From that day on, I drove my car more slowly when I could. The next morning, hoping to avoid a last-minute call that would extend our exhausting shift even further, we drove home the back way from the city where our last patient had been dropped. The passing of the shift's official end time, still miles from home, nonetheless heralded a tangible relaxation in me. They would not call now. The familiar rhythm of the ride home saw the tension ebb away. There was now no chance, for a day at least, of me having to divert my workmate from committing a critical error that could pull us both up before a coroner. What a night, he began after a while. We were fucking lucky that first bloke didn't go off on us. I responded, wondering if his use of the word we. He answered the question in my head. Yeah, we'd have both been for the drop for that one. You distracted me, asking about blankets. In my head I was screaming. Did he really believe I was equally at fault? How could he be so stupid? Had there been a death, an investigation would have uncovered the lack of batteries, yet he wasn't even considering taking the rap alone. At that moment I reasoned that if he was willing to take me down with him in such circumstances, he was on his own next time he screwed up. I stayed silent. Taking a deep breath instead of answering, I smiled. As my mother used to say, just smile and they won't know what you're thinking. Shall we bother refueling before we go back? I asked, trying to change the subject to avoid the pull into a full-on confrontation. Might as well, he replied. Milk the overtime. For once he had a sensible point. Small things make working for the government, usually the most poorly paid and underappreciated professional fate anyone can have, slightly more bearable. And I should get more money for having to put up with this. How the hell had he passed selection? How the hell had he stayed in his job? We passed the next few miles in silence, thoughts crowding in my head. Arriving back in town, we reached the now familiar long queue at the filling station. The newspapers in the rack all sported the same bold headline story, characterized concisely by a broadsheet that read, Thug Violence Mars Religious Rally. Damn, my colleague swore, eyeing the fuel prices. I should have filled up yesterday. Tell me about it, I replied, as we drove round the waiting cars and pulled up at the pump restricted for use by emergency service professionals. The prices on the pumps were astronomical. In fact, they were 4 times more than they'd been just 2 years ago. And for those poor souls who had to use their cars to commute, restrictions on how much fuel they could take at the end of each long wait certainly added insult to financial injury. Of course, tempers often frayed in such circumstances, and I, more and more often, felt that the goodwill shown towards my profession was under strain whenever we cruised by the queues, and especially if we were filling up our private vehicles rather than marked ambulances, regardless of wearing uniform. Shortages and prices of fuel weren't the only thing we had to contend with either. The gap between rich and poor was widening, social tension building, and cultural differences sharpening with each new turn of the screw. I arrived home to a quiet house long before anyone was getting up. I was glad to be home, even if it wasn't often the best place to be. How was your night? Asked my wife sleepily as I slumped back into our warm bed later that morning. I was still damp from a shower, but too tired to dry my hair properly. I had just 11 hours before my next shift started. Sleep beckoned as the neighbour commenced his daily DIY hammering ritual in the semi-detached next door. God, don't ask, I muttered, going out like a light.